Phronesis. Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and thanks to my daughter Kate for developing the intro to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast, where we offer a smart, fast-paced discussion on leadership, communication, and technologies enabling disruption. My guests help us explore timely topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. If you've not done so, please click subscribe so you automatically and seamlessly stay in the know when we publish new episodes. Likewise, please provide me with feedback. What do you like? What do you dislike? And what else would you like to know? And now, today's episode. Today on the program, I have Eric Guthey. He is an associate professor in the Department of Management, Society, and Communication at the Copenhagen Business School. Eric, I am looking forward to this conversation. I want to take us in all kinds of fun, interesting directions. But maybe before we jump in, you are at your farm in
I am.
southern Denmark right now.
Yes.
And we had to delay the podcast a little bit because you had some work on some trees. And you sent me this beautiful photo of a rainbow and a beautiful farmhouse. So tell our audience, I should say, a little bit about you.
Wow. Yeah. So I am what I call a recovering American, in the sense that I have lived in Denmark for 20 years, on September 1st, actually. And I've been at the Copenhagen Business School the whole time, and am a naturalized Danish citizen. So I have double citizenship, and my kids are mostly Danish. And I have come over the years, even right immediately, to love both living in this country and being a European academic and leadership scholar. In fact, one thing I say, hopefully we just bought this farmhouse. It's an old place from the 1800s that's meant to be sort of a vacation home for now and eventually where we will retire. But I'm proud to say that already two prominent leadership scholars who are good friends of mine have already been here. Mary Yule Bean has been to this island last year, and Jonathan Gosling just came through last week and spent a couple days at the farmhouse. So hopefully it will become a place. Hopefully you'll eventually come here.
I'm in.
When Americans can come to Denmark again. So
I am in.
You'd be most welcome.
Now, real quick, couple of your favorite things about Danish culture. What have you fallen in love with?
I love taxes. I love paying taxes. I love the services that I get from paying taxes. And I think Americans have lost their minds because, the rhetoric, the anti-tax rhetoric in the U.S. has literally gotten to the point where people are cutting off limbs to spite themselves because, the way the government works is by collectively providing services that individuals can't provide otherwise, and that businesses will never provide us. And so I'm watching the destruction of the postal service in the U.S. with chagrin because I believe in social democracy and a welfare state. And that is one of the things I love about this country. So, and then on the flip side, and this is something you can get in the U.S. as well, while the tree service guy, Rico, was working in my yard, the farmer who owns all the land around us showed up because he was curious about what was going on. And the kind of he's a wily old Danish farmer who's very nice to us, but also really watches over his properties. And so the rural community on this island where we bought this house is just stunning. So everybody knows everybody and everybody watches out for everybody else, which I quite love as well.
Oh, that's awesome.
So.
Well, one thing as I was reflecting on our conversation today, a place I'd like to start. Of course, this podcast, other than having Steve Kempster on, it's been very U.S. centric. Say that again.
You had Susan Murphy too, who's another recovering American.
I did. You are correct. So Susan and Steve, both in the UK. So we're widening our reach with Denmark now. Making our way through Europe, I guess.
And they've both been here too, by the way. So not to the farmhouse yet.
Well, so what do Americans need to know about European scholarship on leadership? What do we miss? What are we not seeing? What are some of your perspectives in that space?
That's a very interesting question. I would say the overall distinction is somewhat structural and institutional, but also sort of an aesthetic or an intellectual distinction. And so what you have to understand about leadership studies in Europe is that it sprang out of sociology. And specifically in the UK, developed out of a number of, and this goes for management studies as well, a number of scholars who were at the left end of the sociological spectrum, I guess I could say. Okay. Labor process theorists and others who had basically schooled themselves in, Marx, materialist theory and things, but they have a finely tuned sense and continue to have a finely tuned sense of the social dynamics of leadership. Whereas in the US, leadership springs largely out of psychology and social psychology. And that lends itself to both an individualized leader-centered focus that is very strange to many scholars of a European sensibility, and lends itself, in my opinion, also to those wings of the leadership industries that are basically synonymous with the self-help industries. And so there's an interior focus in the U.S. that is very different from the way that scholarship on leadership is primarily. And then you've got the fact that and I part of my research is on what I call on the leadership industries. I mean, there are many countries in Europe where there was no word for leadership before the leadership industries arrived to tell people. In France, if you talk to a leadership consultant, they call leadership leadership because there's no word in French that translates. And in Denmark as well, there wasn't a word called lederskab, which is what the word we use now for leadership in Danish, until the leadership industries were actually specifically Anthony Robbins's coaching franchise arrived first. And it was only after that time that people started distinguishing between management and leadership in the way that they do now. So, and that to me also speaks to the idea that you can talk about some of these organizational and interpersonal processes without moving in such an interior or, I would say even quasi-therapeutic direction. And so that's a major distinction that I would see. Does that making sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. So much more focused on the individual, the leader, as David Day might call it, the leader development, and kind of putting that person, that individual on the pedestal and as the subject of conversation and research versus the social process.
I mean, when did he write that? What's amazing to me is when did David Day write that? Yeah, it was years ago, right?
2000.
I mean, think about it. He wrote that 20 years ago, and it's not like it made a dent in what I would call the, interior leadership industrial complex. I mean, it's still, some people make the distinction, but by and large, I mean, I listened to your podcast with Barbara Kellerman, and although she herself makes the distinction, she still, the way she talks is still very much centered on the leader. I mean, she obviously recognizes both, but it's just the inclination in American cultures, in American circles, is still to move in that direction. Yeah. Now, I would say that because of the way academics works and because of the power of, we just had the Academy of Management and ILA has been coming over here as well, there are many more European scholars who are moving in a much more sort of, and again, I don't want to culturally generalize, but in a more what has traditionally been called an Americanized paradigm of late. Okay. So,
any other distinctions? Any other distinctions that come to mind for you that Americans should be aware of that maybe we don't see?
Well, there's a much more vibrant and strong and accepted. I mean, critical leadership studies is largely or primarily a European phenomenon, and you don't have the Mats Alvesons in the U.S. the way you do here, and so and that's for good and for ill. I mean, there's I think that there are many more, well, and I did, this is an anecdotal statement, but there appear to be many more interdisciplinary approaches to leadership on this side of the Atlantic Ocean to me. And that, I mean, frankly, that's why I ended up here, aside from basic practical reasons. I was not trained in leadership studies. I was trained in American cultural studies. And so many of the ways that when I moved into business schools, I couldn't understand why people were talking about leadership the way that they were. Yeah. And thrived when I got here on a conversation that was much more multidisciplinary and bringing in lots of, so I had more freedom here to do the types of things I want.
Yeah.
intellectually. So,
well, and talk a little bit about at least one of the streams, the leadership fashions. Talk a little bit more about that. One of your streams of writing.
Yeah, we actually have a piece out for review. Well, I have been trying to get published a piece on leadership fashions since 2012.
Wow.
And it has been nearly impossible. And I'm, that could speak to the low level of my scholarship, or it could speak to the fact, which I'm open to, or it could speak to the fact that, when I submitted, well, we'll talk about this openly, the piece that I wrote about leadership fashions, I tried to go way to the top first and I submitted it to the Academy of Management Review. And it got through the first round and it was dinged in the second round. And so I turned it around and tried to fix the things they told me to fix when it was rejected from there and sent it to Leadership Quarterly. And I received a 6-page editorial letter telling me that I had insulted all the great scholars of leadership and that leadership was a science and I knew nothing what I was talking about. I was told I was crypto cynical and that I needed to shut up, basically. So,
Okay.
And so, I would argue that I touched a nerve there that had less to do with the quality of my scholarship at the time than with the fact that I was tweaking some sacred cows, because part of the point of that piece has always been that we leadership scholars are integral parts of the leadership industries, and we kid ourselves if we think otherwise. Yeah. And when I talk about the leadership industries, I distinguish between different basically, I think there's a general and a restricted field of leadership production. And the general field tries to appeal to the most people possible. This comes out of Bourdieu's work on the way that cultural fields operate. But restricted fields of cultural production work by preaching to the choir and making oneself so rarefied and difficult to understand that only the elite can get what you're saying.
Wow.
And I think that many academic fields participate in that dynamic and to legitimize themselves. That was pointing up that divide was something that wasn't too welcome. So, and we're very hopeful to get it. I think it's important to understand the way leadership fashions work. We define them as a social and industrial process that functions to continually redefine the norms and expectations attached to leadership and to argue that certain norms and expectations are better than others.
Yeah.
And so for us, that's the dynamic that keeps churning out so many different leaderships, because it's in no one's best interest in the field of leadership production to put a stop to it and define, when you had Kellerman on, she was interesting, but she was basically arguing that we need to professionalize by finally deciding what leadership is and teaching it the right way. But that in itself, from the perspective that I'm talking about, is a form of product differentiation and an attempt to erect barriers to entry so that other people can't get in. And so I'm much more sanguine about the fact that it's always going to be this way, that since leadership is a cultural product and a symbolic good, there's always going to be bouts in the field about you gain an advantage by innovating and introducing a new idea.
Yeah.
And that's a lesson you learn from studying management fashions, basically back, all management fashions introduce themselves by saying, now is a time of unprecedented change. Everything's completely different than it was before. And so we need a new idea.
Yes.
And, that's what Frederick Taylor said back in the 26, whatever.
20s, yeah.
20s, yeah. So it's almost, you can read the preface to Taylor's Scientific Management is almost verbatim. Which one was it? The Reengineering book. What was that called? The first book about business process reengineering has the exact same preface, because it basically makes the same argument that things have changed so much, we need to change the way we approach organizations. And so leadership scholars are constantly doing that too, saying, times are so different now, we need a completely different approach to leadership. Yeah. Yeah. Even my friend Mary, complexity leadership theory, which is one of my, I respect the hell out of that theory and I use it all the time. And I think it's one of the, I teach it, I use it in my research, but it's introduced as, times are so much more complex now than they were before, that we need to understand complexity leadership theory. Well, I can't remember the name of the economist. Is it Gordon? There's this economist who has argued that the most disruptive technological innovation ever was not the computer chip or the mobile phone. It was indoor plumbing. The toilet. The toilet.
I thought maybe you were going to go to oxen, but that's
He basically said in modern times, I guess, that the toilet changed everything.
Yeah.
And all this stuff about how product cycles are faster than ever, and it's a mantra. My students at Copenhagen Business School are constantly handing in papers where they say, they basically, the first two paragraphs of their papers are always that mantra that they're taught in business schools about how things now are completely different than they ever were before. So we have to think in different ways. And it's just not logically tenable that we're constantly completely different. And so that's why it's interesting to study leadership fashions.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Well, and you've had some adventures lately. I'd love to jump into some of your adventures in the restaurant industry. You sent me a video. It was a wonderful video. I have the permission to share that video with.
Oh, certainly
notes,
do.
Correct?
Yes,
okay.
yeah.
Great.
There's more of those, in fact. So that was just the primer for the collection of videos that we made with the chefs.
So you've been engaged in actually moving from talking, and of course we all straddle these different roles, but you've taken an active role in helping shape the scene and
interesting. Completely accidentally. So
well, talk about it. Tell us about your adventures. This is a lot of fun.
Well, actually what's ironic is, it's moving into the realm of both research and practical action and trying to help an industry, facilitate in any ways I can, help an industry survive the COVID crisis. But basically it came out of teaching because I got very bored with conventional kinds of teaching many years ago and moved heavily into case teaching, primarily because what I really want to do in the classroom is invite students to solve problems together. And I find case teaching to be the best way to do that. And, I have to use a certain amount of theory there, and theory is illuminating, but oftentimes it gets in the way because, especially in a European context, European academics, this is another distinction I would make, and especially in education terms, are highly theoretical. It's like you have a bunch of continental philosophers running around. I was rather impatient with that and also thought that our students needed at least a bit of an alternative from time to time. And so I moved heavily into case teaching, and that's what I like to do. And I was constantly looking for ways to do it differently. And so when I started when I brought CEOs and executives into the classroom, I never let them give a speech. I basically made them read the case and participate in problem solving with students. And the ones that are good will love to do that. And there was one guy, he was the CEO for about 6 years of a Danish biopharmaceutical company. And he ended up hiring my MBA students every year because instead of talking at them, he would roll up his sleeves and work with them.
Nice.
And so in that context, I was looking for different ways to do that, and was at a wine festival with my kids. I love having grown-up kids.
Yeah.
And it turned out the guy who owned the wine bar, they had shut down a street in downtown Copenhagen. It turned out he's one of my former students. And we started talking, and we started brainstorming ways to do things together. And so one of the first events we did, this is actually with Jonathan Gosling, Henry Mintzberg was coming into town. And we threw an event where we filled up Christian's restaurant with half CBS faculty and half CEOs and other executives and Henry.
Nice. And
we served a delightful meal and had a flowing wine and made up small groups and had people really work on some problems together. And it was such a great experience that we kept doing it. And eventually, through that connection, one of the premier restaurants in Copenhagen is Noma, which has been sometimes touted as the best restaurant in the world. And they started an academy for chefs, and they wanted to do leadership in it. So last year, I actually worked with a bunch of chefs from around the world about what leadership means in the kitchen and in culinary contexts.
Wow. Which is a fascinating context, right? I mean, that's traditionally, it's very command and control and yes, chef.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it certainly is traditionally that way. It grows out of, there's a model that was developed, the model for the way kitchens work was the French military from the 19th century, really.
Wow.
But there is a whole generation of chefs that are really rejecting that model, or at least reconsidering it, in conjunction with the sort of the rise over the last 15 years or so of foodie culture in a big way. I mean, Copenhagen has become a food mecca. So through that context, I came to know several of chefs from amazing restaurants around town. And then the crisis hit. February. And I was, at the time, first thing that happened to me was that I got sick. And only, as I told you, only last week did I find out that I actually had COVID myself. So, but at the time, when I was in the hospital, they told me that the tests came back negative. So they thought I didn't have it. Ever since March, I've been walking around saying people that I had all the symptoms, but I didn't have it. But now it turns out that I in fact did have it. But after I got better, we started getting together on Zoom. Christian, this guy who had been my former student, and I brought in some of the chefs that I knew. We started having conversations about the tragedy that was going to happen to the restaurant industry. And now if you look anywhere in the New York Times and all over the place, you can read all about what's happening to restaurants all over the world, because they're places where people come together. That's the whole point of restaurants. It's not, the point. And when you talk to these people, one of the things you learn is it's not, it's about the food, but it's really not just about the food. It's about an experience. I mean, some of these guys say that our business is the business of love. They're really into creating experiences where people come together. And all that has been threatened by the crisis. And so we kept having meetings, and then we realized one of the chefs, amazing, he's an American guy in Copenhagen named Matt Orlando. He had been on a Zoom focus group with another chef from New York. They gathered together a bunch of restaurant goers from around the world to find out what they thought about the idea of possibly going to Aristos back in March, April. And so we said, well, we should replicate that in Copenhagen. And then we decided instead to first do a survey. So I got a bunch of students from Copenhagen Business School to put together a survey about people's attitudes towards going back to restaurants in the face of COVID-19. Yeah. And the 5 master students I got to do it, completely free, did an amazing job. We put this survey up on a Monday afternoon, and within 3 days, we had over 4,500 responses. People were dying to respond and to help. And so we, out of that, developed this sort of mini social movement that is still brewing. And then I managed to get my bosses at CBS to sort of to partner with it. So what we're trying to do is A, figure out how to help the industry during the crisis. Yeah. B, figure out how an academic institution of higher education can facilitate or help in that process, and see how we can partner together to develop new forms of learning and education. I mean, there's so many things that happen in and around a kitchen that should be of interest to other types of organizations. I mean, they are able to, for example, achieve a form of collaboration and flow and peak performance on a regular basis that other industries and companies would die to have. Yeah. And they do it in a completely sort of intuitive and unarticulated way. They just know how to do it. Wow. But when you talk to these chefs, they are amazing people who have amazing sort of self-knowledge of what they do. And so we're figuring out ways to develop vocabularies and literacies that we can use to both help them and figure out how they can help other industries. Yeah. We had an amazing experience last year when we were running this Chef's Academy, where I got together, I did it twice actually. There's a Harvard Business School case about a string quartet that I have used in the past, and about how they achieved artistic flow. And so what I did was I got all the chefs and a string quartet to read the case. And then we got together and had the quartet play and talk. And then we broke them out in small groups, and they analyzed the case, and they found out how many things they had in common and what was different, and, how they achieved creating, both the quartets that we used 2 different quartets, and, some of these chefs, they both are in a situation where their craft is so high that neither you or I would know the difference, but they would take a plate and throw it out. Or the musicians would, we could hear, I don't know how accomplished a musician you are, but musicians can be so good that only people who know well enough what they're doing would know the difference. And so they had this, amazing sort of, symbiosis between the chefs and the cooks, about the discussions about that. And again, that's the type of thing that many teams and many groups would love to figure out how to crack and do. So it's been edifying and humbling to work with these types of people. And
do you think in that context, there's some semblance of just really clear role clarity, that if it's an orchestra, or if it's a quartet, or if it's, I had a conversation once with a friend who was on a SWAT team. And
Yeah.
I asked about leadership in that context,
Mm-hmm.
and his response was, it was almost like he was taken aback, like that there was
Mm-hmm.
some leader. He said, we all have very clear roles on what we
Yeah.
are about to
Yeah.
do, and we fulfill those roles. And one of the episodes you might enjoy is a conversation with Sharna Fabiano. She's done some work with Ira Chalef, who you know, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
she comes out of dance. And we had a
Okay.
really fun conversation about leaders and followers and that relationship.
Yeah.
And so is that a piece of it in that context? Is it the extreme
Well,
role
I think so.
clarity?
I think it is. I think it is a piece of it. Although, and again, I'm humbled by these types of people, but from my understanding, and actually Ralph Bathurst and Donald Atkin wrote a wonderful piece about this that I use sometimes in conjunction with that case. I'm trying to remember the name of it right now. There's an article that they wrote about musical performances. First of all, there's a tendency both with chefs and with musicians to over romanticize what they do. Because, and what I like about what you're saying is that it takes an awful lot of incredibly hard work and mind-numbing boredom to get that good. But what I understand from these people is that they move beyond that role clarity and they literally destroy it and break it down. So they have to, and I've actually had the same discussion with, I had the privilege a couple of years ago, one of my MBA students was from the Italian Special Forces. And another Ph.D. student at CBS teaches at the Danish Defense College. So I've had, and actually this guy, Christian, I mentioned, who owns a restaurant in Copenhagen, he's a former Army officer as well. And so we've had them in the classroom at the same time and worked on some cases. There's a wonderful case from Harvard about a case of friendly fire where the U.S. military shoots down its own Blackhawks in Iraq. And there too, when you talk to special forces people, and I'm way out of my league here, but they achieve what you just said, but it's not just staying in your lane and knowing role clarity. It's resting on that and moving to something that's even more emergent. And it's not just role clarity. And to borrow a word from Mary Bean, it's about interconnectivity.
Wow.
Rich interconnectivity where the roles are interacting with each other in a way that they transform themselves in irreversible ways.
Well, and Sharna, I'm going to get this incorrect, but the episode I believe was called Connect, Collaborate, Create. And she said that you get to, it was almost similar to what you just said, where you get to such a state of flow that you can create with one another. And to your point, you just said it beautifully. Some of that just role clarity kind of washes away and we get to somewhere new, right?
Well, I think that's happening. Actually, I don't want to self-romanticize, but because I'm humbled by the opportunity to work with these people. But the way that we are collaborating in this consortium of chefs and scholars and friends is very much like that, in the sense that clearly there are roles, and I respect greatly what these people do. But the way we're collaborating is very much about, you saw that one video where my student assistant, Victoria, is sitting next to one of the best chefs in the world, and he's totally happy to talk to her, and she's contributing, and it's like the roles are being shed because we're really getting about the business of collaborating and letting connections emerge. And that's, so it's not, the discipline is maybe, I guess, necessary, but not sufficient is what I would say.
Yeah. What else are you thinking about, Eric?
So,
Dr. Guthey, what else is rumbling through that head in the south of Denmark on an island?
I think a lot about my 4 acres of property and how we just, because we didn't know that we had about 22 Mirabella trees. And so it's a massive waste to see in fact, I'm going to, this afternoon after we get off, I'm going to go out and pick some more plums and take them up to one of the chefs I work with said, I'll take some of those plums. So next year we'll be ready to harvest a massive fruit, to reap a massive fruit harvest on this. So I think a lot about that stuff, but I also think a lot about, I think you met my current primary co-author, Nicole Ferry, when we were at ILA a couple of years ago.
Yes.
And she and I collaborate a lot. And so I'm actually learning from her. She's a junior scholar in Seattle, but I think a lot about gender and gender dynamics and gender politics these days. And thinking a lot, she and I collaborate on all this work on the leadership industries. But she brings to the table a very acute and critical sense of gender politics. We just actually won the Academy of Management's award for critical work on gender work and organization with a piece that was from her dissertation. And it was
Nice.
called There Is No Lean In for Men. And it was basically about the idea that, it's great in a way that we celebrate women's leadership. And there's a whole wing of the leadership industry called women's leadership. But there's no such thing as men's leadership, or there is, but it's a bunch of fringe wacko right-wingers and men's group movements. But basically, the word leadership is assumed to be a general neutral term. But in fact, she gives the analogy, there's a marked and an unmarked term. When we say gay marriage, we're basically assuming that marriage is heterosexual. So, and by the same token, when we say women's leadership, what is leadership then if it's not? So we're thinking about the ways that the leadership industry themselves are heavily gendered and trying to figure out, I think that, building on the fashions work that we did, that there's something about the discourse of leadership that has to do with affect and emotion. Leadership is the realm of management where we're allowed to talk about emotions. And the leadership industries have picked up on that. And that's largely why the leadership industries are in many ways synonymous with the self-help industries.
Yeah.
So, I'm not about the business of just dismissing that. I really just want to understand it sociologically.
Yeah.
What's going on there. So the next thing we're doing in that stream of research is we published a piece earlier this year in the Journal of Business Ethics that's called Stardom Early. It's again based on Nicole's dissertation research. It's about undergraduate. Well, and actually, you would know a lot about this, but more than I would. But it's about leadership development workshops in undergraduate programs. And I know you've done some work there. But it was taking a very European critical approach to, basically we were arguing that, in a nutshell, the argument was this: it's a bit hard to understand why self-governing adults in a democratic society submit themselves to oftentimes very intrusive forms of leadership development that ask them to open up about their personal lives. I mean, in Europe, we have a very different negotiated sense of where the line is between personal and workplace.
Yeah.
But even here, my neighbors my next door neighbor is constantly about the business of saying, my company has no business demanding that I go, sleep in a tent in my underwear with my colleagues. That's not part of my job description, as part of our leadership development. So that article basically argued that, well, why do people do this? They do it because we start them very early. When they're undergraduates, we put them in leadership development programs that submit them to all sorts of sort of disciplinary practices. And we focus specifically in that paper on icebreakers and assessment tools like Clifton StrengthsFinder.
Yep.
And so next we're going to we actually want to do a study of the business of the leadership assessment industry. Not the scientific validity of the instruments, but the financial and market dynamics of why these things are so popular and how they've spread so fast.
Oh, sure.
So,
sure.
And to my knowledge, no one's done. There's been a couple of great things written about assessments. Peter Case has a piece about how Myers-Briggs actually, I thought it was just a joke at first because it was about alchemy, but there's actually a historical link between the way Myers-Briggs works and the way alchemy works. Sort of quasi mystical, astrological, and so I can't remember exactly the argument works now, but what we want to do is figure out why these things are so massive and so popular and what type of effect that has,
Well, I'm working on a paper right now with Dave Rush and Ron Riggio that we're going to submit. And we're looking at the adult learning literature, and the adult learning literature, if you look at some of the historic orientations of adult learning, you have, cognitivism, so the mental processing and the theoretical components, and you have behaviorism, that skill-based domain, and social cognitive, the social learning theory, Bandura, who are our role models. And then you have the constructivist, which would be making meaning from experience. But then you have humanistic. And that humanistic domain is where I think a lot of that, what you're speaking of, kind of exists, right? That's that self-awareness, identity, motivation, values. And so if you have programming, like to your point, like a Tony Robbins or a landmark education, the old EST, then you're right in that, the Werner Erhard kind of you're right in that space, right? So are
you writing about landmark in that piece, or?
we mention Landmark, we mention Tony Robbins only because we
Mm-hmm.
can't think of another kind of adult in the States. The humanistic domain most often occurs in student affairs or
Yeah.
in religious kind of context. At least that's kind of that's
Right.
how we're thinking about it right now, is that those
Mm-hmm.
kind of areas focus
Mm-hmm.
fairly heavily, just like business school would focus heavily on the cognitivist domain.
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
Student affairs programming or religious programming oftentimes kind of focuses in that domain as well. But
Interesting.
we couldn't
Yeah.
think of anything really from an adult perspective that an adult would pay money to go to, that's a leadership development program, other than some of those types of experiences. And to your point, yeah, they
I
start
want to think about that. I
using.
mean, it's not coming off the top of my head, but my impression is that it is really prevalent. I mean,
Mhm.
but maybe, we have to put our money where our mouth is, and empirically sort of show that that the leadership industries are about self-help. I mean, that's why one of the things I'm actually trying to develop, and this might be something we could talk about down the road, is I had a master's student a couple of years ago that knew how to scrape the web with robotic process automation, that she could send robots out that would run around the web and catch things. And for a while we were talking about using that to find out about leadership. And specifically one of the things I wanted to do was find out how many damn colleges and universities in the US basically, if I were to use the terms that I would use over a beer, I would say force Clifton Strengths down their students' throats. Because what they do is they send out the Clifton Strengths tool to students before they even arrive on their first day of campus.
Yeah.
And then they create total strengths environments.
Yeah.
And, that's a decision that no student has actually made. There's a very powerful institution that's telling them this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So I think you're right that it is in fact student affairs where that happens in spades.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and schools are spending massive amounts of money, sending money, and Gallup is a privately held organization that is reaping massive amounts of money from American higher education, because all these students are being told the way you become a leader is you consume this commercial product that these people have made.
Well, and in reality, if again, let's go back to cooking real quick. And I've said this before on this podcast, but if you want to create a world-class chef, you probably need all 5 of those domains of learning. This individual is going to have the knife skills. They're going to have the education and the cognitive ability and the mental processing to do the work. They're going to have the experience and have made meaning from that experience. And they're going to have had mentors. And of course, if you have a self-aware individual who that humanistic domain probably is less prioritized, kind of like maybe with a surgeon, for instance, or a pilot, for instance. But it's an important domain. But when it's the only domain, I would pick on student affairs if that's the only domain. If we're doing leadership development or leader development, and the humanistic orientation is really the only one we hit, I think you're limited. Or the Boy Scouts, for me, again, you have a great experience potentially, and we can make meaning of that experience. But if I don't have any cognitive structure to kind of bump up against, or I haven't really been intentional about what I was practicing because I don't have the theory in my head, I might be limited. Or I believe sometimes in business schools, every mission statement says we're creating leaders, right? At top 20, we just in this paper we looked at top 25 U.S. news, and everyone but 2 in their vision, mission, or purpose had created leaders.
Yeah,
or AACSB, or it's leadership. But in business schools, we tend to focus on that cognitive domain. So I love what you're doing because it's much more experiential and it's multifaceted. It's integrative. It's not just unidimensional, because you're not going to have a world-class chef if you've put him in a classroom and discussed case studies for a semester. That's one dimension of the learning, for sure, right? But you aren't going to have a chef.
Yeah. Although let me just jump in there briefly, because I mean, just to clarify, there's 2 different conversations that are not unconnected, but they are different in the sense that we're not about the business of creating a world-class chef. What we're trying to do is create a sense of, well, first of all, we're trying to help them survive, but we're also what's been fascinating to me is that these chefs who are themselves chef owners are all vitally concerned with employee welfare and choice. And so they want to create a more equitable. One of the things we're going to be doing is working out a workplace charter for how people should expect to be able to be treated in culinary workspaces, because the history has been horrendous.
Yeah.
And so there's a difference between, and this speaks to the undergraduate experience as well. And maybe this is also a thing about another European/American divide. I mean, I try to approach my students as self-governing adults that can make their own decisions about how they educate themselves.
Sure.
And so for me, it's not about creating world-class chefs, but about helping members of the culinary community be informed citizens of that community and participate in the governance of that community. Same as in
you're intentional about that purpose, which I think is the key, right? Because you're not. I think a lot of, in at least what I've experienced, I think sometimes we have leadership educators or people who think they're developing leaders. They really kind of believe they are, when in fact they're developing one dimension and then putting people out there in the world with this, oh, I'm a leader now. And I think it's setting people up at times for failure, but you're intentional about what you're putting into motion.
Well, you're giving me a lot of credit. Maybe I don't. I'm trying to figure stuff out as I go along.
But I think that's what's key, right? I mean, if it's a business school and if it's the cognitive domain, yes, we say we're developing leaders, but are we at least even aware that we're developing one dimension of your growth? And it's an important dimension, but it's also a little bit of a stretch to say, hey, Jimmy, you're ready to go.
Yeah. Although my emphasis has always been, I think we had this conversation when we first met too.
Yeah.
What I am interested in is developing leadership as a collective capacity or even a social movement, not as an individual capability or skill. I just, that may be a thing. I actually when I tell my students, I mean, this isn't a visual podcast, but if you picture my arm like a meter, the meter has been pushed so far over to the individual side that I consider it my, sort of contribution with students to just push the meter back the other way so that maybe it'll balance in the middle at some point in time.
Yeah.
But
the whole leadership development, right?
I'm much more interested, in just, first of all, I like working with other people. Some of the scholars you've had on your podcast and the people we run around with, I just enjoy running around. We decided several years ago, Steve Kempster, myself, Mary Olbein, several others, we just started putting ourselves in situations we didn't understand to learn things that we didn't know we would learn.
Yeah.
We did a bunch of work with refugee communities. We did a bunch of work in South Africa when it was possible for us to do that. We threw a workshop we worked with the Center of Creative Leadership and got a bunch of money to throw a workshop in Geneva about leadership in post-conflict and post-war zones. We had no business being there, but we did it because we wanted to learn. And we got military types and diplomats together. It was fascinating. And so this restaurant work is an extension of that. I mean, I'm totally serious when I say making it up as I go along, because I'm now in the last 10 years of my career, I just want to have fun and learn things I didn't know I would learn. So, and who wouldn't want to, work with people that often, once in a while feed you an amazing meal and,
it's a benefit.
Aside from being fascinating people and generous people but also really professional people. So it's more a question of, maybe it's selfish. I like to, putting myself in a position to learn rather than, but so my point would be, to me, it's a collective endeavor. Yeah. That's for me, the most fun,
Yeah.
So for example, working alongside a guy as fun as Steve Kempster,
Yes. Oh,
or with,
awesome.
So
such a good man. Such a good man. Well, Eric, let's wind down here. Oftentimes I'll conclude with a little bit of a speed round. And so I'd love to know what you're streaming or reading or listening to.
Oh, yeah. I have a request.
Yeah.
I've loved your previous podcast, but I have to tell you, I'm totally disappointed.
Really?
For the following reason. I noticed that you started at least two of the other podcasts by coming up with 2 words to describe the person. I was like, I wonder what Scott's going to say about me. And you didn't do it. Now I'm like, oh, I didn't rate. I'm not the 2-word guy. I even had 2 words for you.
Eric. So you were going to come back at me with some words. So Eric, I'm going to add yours in. I'm going to add yours in the reflection. So literally, when you listen to David Day, I recorded that while you were having your tree done. My reflection of my podcast with him. Sometimes
you did it just now.
I do it after. Yeah, I did it this morning.
Wait, you just recorded David Day this morning?
No, I recorded David Day a couple days ago, but I always edit it and then reflect on it and then
I get it.
kind of provide a little bit of a summary. And sometimes those 3 words come then. So you're going to have to wait.
I'll wait.
You can tell me my 3 words though, if you'd like. But
it's only 2 actually. The first one was surprising because, you and I've had this conversation.
Yeah.
I'm a kind of a jerk. So when I meet people, I decide whether I like them or not. And I met you and I was like, I'm never going to like this guy. And I was pleasantly surprised. I think I really enjoy hanging out with you. That's my first one. And the second one I told you already. You have an amazing radio voice, my friend. When I first turned on the podcast, I was like, oh yeah, Scott's voice. That's really soothing. So it might be that big ass microphone you got there too. So
I'm a little tired of listening to it at this point. I'll tell you that. That's for sure.
Your daughter's voice is very nice too. So.
Well, so tell me what you're streaming, reading, or listening to. What comes to mind? Anything interesting?
Oh, what am I listening to? This week, I've been listening to Slate Podcasts has something called Hit Parade. And there's this scholar, he's not even a scholar, but this guy who does this amazing, he's a critic, cultural critic, and it's a series of podcasts that are amazing dissections of the history of interaction between different musical genres in the top 40.
Oh, wow.
So I just listened to one this morning about the bands that benefited the most from Woodstock.
Oh, interesting. Who was
the top one? Well, the top one was Santana.
Okay.
The second, number 2, was Neil Young and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. But it was a really interesting sort of capsule history of Woodstock.
Oh, yeah.
And I can't remember the guy's name, but it's called Hit Parade.
I think that was almost their second performance, CSNY.
Yes, exactly. And Neil Young didn't even go on until halfway through because, and they were up there whining about how they were new and didn't know what they were afraid. And then he came on stage and blew them all away.
So good.
And that same podcast has a really great 2-part history of rap, its relationship with the top 40. So nice. It's really good.
Nice.
So that and a lot of other podcasts and yeah. So.
Well, David Day talked about a television show called The Bridge, which was Scandinavian noir that he absolutely loved.
Show. Yeah, it's fantastic, and it's as much about the relationship between Danes and Swedes as it is about the murder mystery that's happening.
Yeah,
it starts out with a body is found on the bridge between Denmark and Sweden, and when by the end of the first episode, you discover that it's actually the top half of one body and the bottom of another body. So one is Danish and one is Swedish.
I'm going to have to spoiler alert there, Eric.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing about Denmark. It's such a small country that I've run into the 2 top male leads from that. There's 2 different guys that play the cop in that show. And I've run into both of them because it's one of the great perks of living in a country of 5 million people is that you run into people all the time. So really interesting guys. Kim Bodnia and what's the other guy's name? Tura Lindhardt is his name. Tough name to say.
Eric, you got to get back to the farm.
I do. I have to go pick some plums and wish you were here to help.
I do too, Eric. I do too. Very much so.
I mean, are you virtually participating in the ILA conference this fall?
I am.
I will virtually. Yeah, I'll virtually. Nicole and I have a paper there. I'll virtually see you there.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much for the conversation. I appreciate it.
It was gratifying to be included. So thanks. It's great to talk to you too.
Okay. Be well.
You too. Take it easy.
So Eric wanted his 2 words. 2 words. Eric, if you're still listening, if you've listened to your own episode, now you get your 2 words. For me, the words are contrarian. And I mean that in the best possible way. Eric is looking at this topic of leadership, not in the conventional way. He's looking at it from every angle, and he's very interested in understanding the whole. And I really, really enjoy having conversations with him because he helps me see things that I hadn't seen. My second word is cool. I mean, he's listening to podcasts about Woodstock while picking plums on his farm in southern Denmark. He's a foodie. He's putting some of what he knows into action and making a difference in his community. And he just makes Copenhagen sound incredible. Now, I know that this podcast has been somewhat U.S.-centric, and so a goal of mine is to really, in the next 6 months, recruit other voices, other perspectives, other viewpoints, so that we, in the spirit of Eric, can better understand leadership. Have a great day, everybody. As always, thank you for checking in. Be well. You have been listening to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast. If you liked what you heard, please share it with others and let them know what we're up to. And one last quick reminder to click subscribe so you know when we publish new episodes. And of course, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can stay in touch with me by visiting www.scottjallen.net or any number of social media platforms. Be well, be safe, and make a difference wherever you are on this beautiful planet. And now, here's Kate's twin sister, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.